Apple A19 Pro chipset, Tensor G5, Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 for Galaxy. We do have the 8 Elite Gen 5 over here on the OnePlus, and we're not going to go ahead and single out any phone in this video or any specific brand because that's not the point of this video. But why phone specs are a lie, and not literally, like, you do get the chip that's mentioned in these devices. You do get the RAM, you get 12 gigs here, 12 gigs here, 16 gigabytes here. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is deeper than this. What I'm saying is that in 2026, we're getting to the point where, you know, some of these phone specs just kind of feel like a lie in reality in terms of what we're actually getting from all of these products. And let's go ahead and discuss multiple areas where I think, and I've been feeling this way a while, where these phones just don't live up to the hype. And I want to talk about benchmarks to begin. So the benchmarks we tend to cover in the speed tests, and this might seem like I'm going against myself as I do speed tests, but not really, because I include benchmarks at the end of my app test just for those people that want to see what the results are. But as someone who does a lot of these speed tests, what we'll find often is that the benchmarks are very close in terms of the competition. They tend to give you similar results overall. But what we tend to find is that when opening apps, when actually launching, you know, the day-to-day stuff you're going to use, the smoothness, the animations, they're all kind of competitive there. And so the benchmarks tend to be definitely don't really seem to matter in reality. One of the best examples of this is going to be the Pixel over here. So the Google Pixel Tensor G5, this phone on a spec sheet just absolutely gets demolished by the competition. But anybody who actually owns the Pixel knows that this phone is still a very great performer in the day-to-day. It's optimized hardware and software by Google. So this phone actually, and there's no excuse for not having a faster chip. Let's not get it twisted. But this phone actually performs really well for day-to-day. I don't ever have really any slowdowns, and in my actual real-world daily use, it doesn't aggravate me at all. Although in a speed test, you would be seeing that the Samsung, the OnePlus, the iPhone absolutely crushing, and we might do a triple comparison soon to see the actual results, as I haven't done that yet. But you would think that it's just the end of the world, you know. But you would think that it's just no way. Nope. After you see a speed test. But the reality is that the Pixel feels very premium. It's a very nice operating phone day to day, getting on with your day to day use. It's really not that much different from the other devices here on the table. So that's what I mean by specs are kind of a lie. You see them like, wow, you know, this phone is just going to be really slow. It's compared to those phones after seeing the speed test, but the reality is it's just not. And so I could pick up any of these day to day, and they all tend to give me kind of the same type of experience I need in terms of everything opens fast, everything opens smooth. And so while I would like to see a faster chip on the Pixel, I understand they go for the AI. And I believe I said 12 gigs of RAM earlier. This is actually 16 gigs on the Pixel. So that was my mistake. That's for the AI. But the Pixel tends to perform really well. So that's a good example for the pink benchmark versus reality. Another one is the iPhone here, the 17 Pro Max. So the 17 Pro Max benchmarks extremely high, but when you start actually using it, you'll find that the actual operations are a little bit slower, but like polished for Apple software, so that their animations aren't the fastest. They don't snap through everything as fast as you might think that benchmark score would indicate. But where it really shines is underneath. The actual performance day to day is basically flawless most of the time. You do get a few app crashes here and there if the app is not well optimized, but it's pretty rare for that to happen. It happens very rarely. I would say for me, that only happens about once every like few months or so. So it's not very common at all for the day-to-day on the 17 Pro Max. And you'll see right here, peak benchmarks on the Galaxy are actually extremely high, the highest here that I've seen. And in reality, though, this doesn't really tend to perform much better than last year's S25 Ultra. It doesn't seem to perform much better than a OnePlus or even an iPhone. But the thing is that, you know, it does have the highest benchmark. And you would think like, okay, it's blowing away the competition. While I will say that it does feel a little snappier in terms of animations, day to day, it doesn't really feel like I'm using a much different phone than any of the other ones here, even though the specs would indicate that. There is an area though we'll get on to next, and that is the thermal throttling of these phones. So is the thermal throttling a lie? And the answer is no. They actually do thermal throttle, but for good reason. If they get too warm, then these devices, the spec of, the thermals in here will definitely, and the thermals will definitely need to, come down a bit so the phone doesn't overheat. That's definitely a real thing. It doesn't really happen too much on the OnePlus. This phone stays pretty cool to the touch. But the honest truth is that most people don't really think about this secret area. It is improving though, but you think like when you see these processors and these specs that like you can just push these things to the max, and while you can really push them pretty hard, they will throttle back if you go too hard on them. Although again, this is very much improving with these vapor chamber phones like OnePlus, iPhone, Galaxy. So most people cannot push them to a level where they will start throttling a lot. But under gaming load, some of them will. So that's for sure. The Pixel probably the most here of the three. But the truth is that you can't really take like full advantage of any phone like you could like a desktop PC with fans and stuff. You know what I mean? Because these are mobile devices. So if they hit a point where they're getting too hot, these phones will scale back and not give you the top performance. However, I don't think most consumers are ever going to use that. So that could be a moot point for a lot of people. But at the same time, we did have to mention that here because when we're talking about phone specs being a lie, they tend to always like talk like they're the fastest things in the world. But while they are pretty fast day to day. In reality, if you push them hard enough, they will pull back a bit on performance. Now, the software versus the raw hardware. So you'll see like, oh man, the 200 megapixel camera here, the S Pen, we have the biggest screen on the market, and that's awesome. I'm not knocking any brand here. We're using Samsung as an example because they are usually the king of specs. I would say they usually give you the best specs, but nowadays some of the competitors are like the Chinese brands are definitely upping the ante there. But the reality is that in the real world, sometimes software matters more. I mean, here's a perfect example. The iPhone 17e. This device has iOS on board. And for some people, they would rather have an iPhone 17 or a 17e for the software, not for the hardware. Of course, they would know S26 Ultra is amazing, but I'm good with the 17e. You might hear people think this way because the truth of the matter is that software often trumps hardware. And so the spec sheet doesn't always say the whole story. Some people would rather use iMessage FaceTime and save $800 and get a simple iPhone 17e than pay $1,300 and get software One UI 8.5 that they don't want to run. And so that's why the spec sheet doesn't say the whole story. And then in the iPhone land, if you want to pay a little bit more, you got multiple options to go up that ladder if you want. You got 17, 17 Pro, 17 Pro Max, Air. I mean, you have it. But I wanted to use this one as an example because you can get into the Apple ecosystem with this. It's kind of similar to what you can do with the Mac OS system now with MacBook Neo. You can use the MacBook Neo to get into the Mac OS, and that often trumps getting a Windows laptop if you've been wanting to get a Mac OS computer. So that's what I'm talking about. Software often trumps hardware. You know, it just does. And the truth of the matter is that the spec sheet would tell you having all these cameras, having this battery is a big deal. But I would almost bet a lot of people would still choose a 17E over some of these flagship Android phones simply because they don't want Android software. And so that is just something to point out. And let's not get it twisted. We can flip that script as well. Some people would literally choose a budget Android phone because they don't want iPhone software. So it can be the both ways around. Or they would choose a really high value, medium tier, mid-range phone on the Android side like Pixel 8a, nothing 4a Pro, phones like this to go ahead and avoid getting a cheaper iPhone 17e. So it can go both ways. I don't want you to think that I'm only saying it could happen for Apple. It can go both ways. Now the next one is going to be the camera megapixel myth. So I'm going to use Samsung again here. I'm not trying to single out Samsung. They just usually have some of the largest megapixel counts. But you can see they can go all the way up to 200 megapixels. But see, the thing is that, you know, just because they can do this doesn't mean that everybody and their mama wants to go ahead and use the results they get out of the Samsung. They might actually like those, but some people might pick up a Pixel and say, you know what, I like how that processes the images. I just like how it looks. The Pixel photo looks to me better. I don't care that it doesn't have as many megapixels. So this one is really an old topic. You know, we've been talking about that in the past about megapixels. A lot of people have figured this out a long time ago, but the truth is that it's still very much relevant in 2026 because you'll actually find a lot of budget phones with like these high megapixel counts, and you would think, oh my God, this is a great deal. But the truth is that some of those budget phones still have pretty bad cameras that will get destroyed by a 12 megapixel Pixel, for example, on their main sensor, although the Pixel can do 50 megapixels as well. The iPhone's another good example. They don't even have a 50 megapixel yet. It's just 48, but a lot of people would still prefer the results they get from iPhone when especially loading up to social media. Maybe even they prefer just the results in general. They might also prefer the front-facing camera, which is much wider than the competition, although it's not the highest count. So you would see 18 megapixels on an iPhone, and you would think, well, I've seen Android phones with 50 megapixels, but the fact of the matter is none of them are this wide. And so the iPhone is still a better experience. So again, another spec lie right there. You would think 50 megapixel front cameras, these 30 megapixel, whatever you see on those front systems on some phones, you would think that the iPhone is worse, but it's actually not. So that's what I'm saying. You can't always fall for these specs there. Now, the next one is the AI inflation, or performance inflation. So you'll see that in most of these newer phones, you're seeing them pad the spec sheet with NPU this, AI this new AI feature. When the fact of the matter is your phone, do you really need all of those features? Or the truth is that this is a new thing that they're trying to do, is like get you with the AI stuff. But the truth is that you probably are only going to use some of the basic AI features, which is what most people can do on pretty much any phone, which is to use cloud-based AI applications. Yes, the tools on board are nice, the rewrite tools and things of that sort on most phones. And yes, having Circle to Search and Gemini Key, that's pretty cool and all that. But the reality is you can actually access these on even older phones, most of this. And I think that if you are going to seriously use AI, most people are probably going to use it on a laptop where they can actually, you know, highlight things a lot easier and use all the AI stuff, maybe photo AI editing. It's going to be a lot easier to, you know, precisely control that on a laptop. And so for that reason, I think that this AI stuff is kind of a little bit getting ridiculous. Like it seems like it's like the only thing they talk about now at the end of the day, and still kind of giving us same old phones pretty regularly. But still, would you prefer a AI based image like something the Pixel produces, especially on its AI Magic Zoom, or do you prefer a raw image that you can get on some older phones? So something like an iPhone 14 Pro Max that came out a few years ago was more of a raw camera type experience, not a lot of AI going on board here, 48 megapixel. And this image is very natural looking. It doesn't really have too much processing. Yeah, every smartphone has some processing, you know, with their algorithms to go ahead and process the image to make it look sharper. But some of these older phones still produce a really clean, natural image that doesn't have all this processing. And I've heard a lot of people talk about how they enjoy the older phones, how they didn't really do all that extra processing, making some of the images look a little bit artificial. So that's something that I think is becoming a bigger topic now, is that, you know, some of the images and things you're seeing don't even look like reality. And so that could be something that manufacturers go back towards for some people out there who want to have more of a realistic image, or at least give us an option to turn off some of that processing if we want a more clean, natural image. That would be really awesome. I'm sure some phones are already doing it at this point. The next one is the peak brightness illusion. Now I'm going to use the Samsung to talk about this one. Samsung is one of the best for peak brightness. It gets really bright, but why I say it's one of the best is because this spec on here allows you to go ahead and actually access it. This feature allows you to access this top spec right here in the high brightness mode. So extra brightness mode right here. But why is it kind of a lie overall on most phones, and including this one as well? And that is that these extra brightness modes, while Samsung is very honest and tells you that it does use more battery, as the phone gets a little bit too warm, it will automatically dim the display. So if you think you're going to run this thing at max brightness all day, you better think again. Also, when you hit these high brightness modes in like a sunny day in a warm climate or whatever, and you're outside, eventually that brightness, the phone will get a little too warm and it will crank it down, and then you can't even really see anything. Now, this doesn't happen too frequently if you're not using your phone a lot. Like if you're just quickly checking it, they will all hit their peak brightness, that's for sure. But the reality is if you think you're going to be outside using it constantly or heavily, that peak brightness is not really accessed too much. So that spec to me doesn't really add up. I think, you should just kind of see how they look brightness wise in the store, see what you like for under indoor lighting, because that's probably where you're going to see what you're going to be using most of the time, as the auto brightness will crank it up once in a while, but you're not going to be able to stay in that auto brightness, that highest brightness mode for a very long period of time, like you would if you had like a laptop or a computer plugged into the wall. You can sustain that high brightness because it's on an outlet for the entire time, and they have a lot more area in the laptop to go ahead and disperse that heat. So that's something to think about, when you see those high brightness specs, especially some of these ones where you're seeing like 6,000 nits and all this. The truth is you're not going to be in there too much. That's just the reality of that subject right there. Now, the battery life spec is another one I want to discuss, and I think I'm going to use Samsung again here on this one. And the reason why I'm going to use Samsung is because they've been sticking with this 5,000 milliamp. And yes, while they do tend to improve year over year, the S26 Ultra being better than the S25 Ultra, even with the same size spec, the reality is that the 5,000 doesn't always mean it's the best out there. I want to bring in a phone. You probably are going to be like, why are you even bringing that in here? That shouldn't even be in the conversation, but it does make sense. I'll tell you why. So this is a Nothing Phone 3A Lite. It's just a budget nothing device. Not super exciting by comparison to these phones, but it has a 5,000 milliamp hour battery, same size as the one in the S26 Ultra, but it lasts longer. Why? Because it's a budget device. It doesn't push as much power, and so that's why you have to not think that always just because you see 5,000 is going to be the longest lasting. There's phones with 5,000 that are cheaper that last longer. It comes down to how the hardware software is optimized, as well as the chipset, which is why the S26 Ultra is actually better than previous Ultra phones. But at the same time, you'll find the battery spec being higher on the One Plus, but the real reason the One Plus is better is not necessarily only just because its spec is higher. That does have a lot to do with it, but the real reason is because it's a silicon carbon. One Plus has been optimizing their software for quite some time, and their chipset, everything is very well optimized there. And you'll find too on the Pixel, this phone has very, very strong standby because Google is controlling it top to down. So that's a really big deal. And then you'll find on the iPhone, only slightly bigger than the Samsung, but has much longer lasting standby, even though that battery is only slightly bigger. You'll also find some older iPhones that have smaller batteries that might even last longer than some of these other Android phones. Probably not the One Plus, but you get what I'm saying. Sometimes that battery size spec doesn't always live up to the reality of what we're actually going to get. So that spec still comes down to, some other things, and including the iPhone getting better thermals this year allows that battery to last longer for better efficiency. So there's other things that matter, not just the size of the battery itself. So you got to really do your research before you decide to buy a phone for battery, because you might be disappointed if you just think, oh, if I get that size of a battery, it's going to be good. Not always. That's not always the case. So do keep in mind, do your research on that one before you go ahead and take the jump just because you look at a size of a battery. And so the final one I want to talk about here is the future-proof illusion to justify high price tags. We do see these promises of extremely long software years of updates, 7 years on some of them. And while this is a very strong selling point, because a lot of people are like, wow, I could have that phone for 7 years. Here's the reality. Your screen is probably going to give out. Maybe you're going to crack it. Maybe some issue happens to it over time. That one's not super likely, but it can happen within 7 years of heavy use. Not likely, though, for some of these newer phones, but that's just something to think about. Also, the battery and you're going to have to replace the battery. Almost guaranteed if you're going that long on heavy use, you're likely going to do it. Even if you don't, you're going to have a really trash battery in probably about 4 years of heavy use. Your battery is just not going to last nowhere near like day one. I think the reality is this is kind of illusion, this future proof of 7 years, because the truth is I think most people will likely upgrade, or their hardware will start getting weaker over time. I think that the iPhone and Samsung does a pretty good job with this right now. And also the OnePlus with its hardware, but like the Pixel, the chip, I don't know about the chip in the Pixel, but that 16 gigs of RAM will probably help it in the long term. But Pixel also has really good software, so that helps as well. The truth is that I just don't see, this whole software upgrade thing, 7 years actually being, people keeping it that long. I just think certain things are going to happen in that period where they're just not going to keep it that long. So let me know if you agree with that one down below. That's more of a separate point over specs. We're still seeing a lot of spec advertisements and stuff like that, but the truth is that a lot of these things don't always live up to it. And they're kind of like, there was a time when phones year over year were just so exciting. And I still think that they do come out with things that are exciting, like foldable phones. We might see the iPhone Fold later. This new color was pretty awesome on the iPhone over here. I like this Moonstone as well. But I still think we need to see more of phones that are rocking the boat a little bit more going forward. I'm just really excited to see if we can start seeing bigger changes. I think that's what we need now. Anyway, if you guys found this video entertaining, informing, do me a favor, click that like button for me, subscribe if you haven't already, and stay tuned for more content like this. I'll catch you on the next one. Nick here. Be sure to be well, and let's discuss down below. Peace.